Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today, we're very happy to have with us Alan Davison. Alan is currently a professor in the Governance and Public Affairs Centre at the Australian Catholic University. Before that, for a good few years, he was Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Technology in Sydney. He was a co-founder of the Permission to Think series within the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast with Szeps, and he is now also the president of the Australian Free Speech Union. So welcome to Free Kiwis, Alan.
Thanks, gentlemen. Absolute pleasure to be on the podcast.
Now, Alan, you're a philosopher by training, is that right?
Well, actually, even arguably less esteemed and relevant in today's society, I was actually a musicologist. So my expertise was visual and musical culture through the long 19th century in Europe. However, I've had a long-term interest in epistemology, history and philosophy of science, so on and so forth. And as a training as a philosopher in musicology, of course, we did a lot of work on cultural studies. This is in the 90s, late 90s, the beginning of the rise of postmodernism, if you like, in the academy really becoming to the forefront. And so a lot of work around cultural history, epistemology, a lot of work around, Foucault and the French thinkers and so on and so forth. So that's my background. So it's not just music per se, but it's sort of history and culture.
Right.
Sorry, were you saying there that you yourself were a sort of proponent of the use of Foucault in your work, or you just observed that in your field in general?
More observed it in the early, almost uncritical acceptance of Foucault in the 90s, which I think staggered me. And that's not to say, of course, there's not a lot of interest in what Foucault was writing about in terms of power and institutions. What was more concerning to me, even in those early days when I was a postgraduate student, was pretty much the uncritical acceptance of anything that's in Foucault, and it was sort of read out with an almost sacred text-like reverence that, Foucault wrote this, and so, okay, well, so that's the end of the discussion. So
I actually remember it from
very early on.
I remember it from a little earlier. I was a science student at Monash in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, and I certainly remember some of my humanities colleagues getting very enthusiastic about this thing called postmodernism. And as a science student, it never made any sense to me, and I thought it would disappear within a few years because it just seemed completely divorced from reality. I still think it is, but I was wrong that it didn't gain traction.
Well, that's a fascinating point, because my early days were thinking this stuff is, a little bit of interest in it, but in general, it's so divorced from the world around us, it will never have an impact. And then sort of 20 years later, you wake up and it's everywhere. It's taken to be reality. So how wrong we were in those early days.
And it's Foucault's world now, we're just living in it. Yeah, I had a very similar experience to you when I was a PhD student at Stanford. I was in classics department, but I was on the ancient history track. And because of that, I had to take a compulsory course in the theory of history. And that was taught in the history department. Now, Stanford ancient historians were kind of trailblazing an approach to ancient history that was based on social science methodology, which I really liked. But for whatever reason, that requirement was still on the books. So I took this course in the history department, and that was very much sort of training in postmodernism. And it wasn't a bad course. I mean, I read a lot of interesting stuff. Foucault, I think, is an interesting thinker in some ways. It just struck me that it was quite univocal. And the way that we treated those thinkers was very different, for example, to the way that we treated thinkers, even very great thinkers, when I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate. So, I remember studying Aquinas, Aristotle, great figures of philosophy like that when I was an undergraduate. And basically the technique was to read what they'd written in the original, if possible, read a lot of secondary scholarship on it, and then basically write essays where you tore them to shreds, and actually that's kind of a problem for undergraduates. You need to train them a little bit to sort of respect these thinkers a bit more. But basically that was the way we went about it. And I definitely got a sense in that class that you weren't really meant to criticize oracles like Foucault. That wasn't really the point of the class. The point of the class was to lay out, how to do history in the Foucauldian way.
Yeah, and really the thing that you see now that's the giveaway is, something through the lens of something. And as soon as they say through the lens of, you see it in the abstract or in the introduction or in the methodology section, it's basically through the tunnel vision of a particular set of assumed critical theory or whatever it happens to be. So it's definitely gone in the opposite direction now.
The thing that floored me as a science student was the kind of casual dismissal of evidence. That they were completely uninterested in verifying anything empirically. In fact, that was kind of seen as a potential power play to attempt to do so.
Yeah, well, what could be more white or cis-normative than actually asking for empirical evidence?
Apparently.
But it's certainly true that even in those early days, this sort of strong sociology of science emerged with great enthusiasm from people that sort of half understood Thomas Kuhn, if they'd even read him. And of course, he backtracked quite a bit from some of the stronger comments in initial evaluations in his work. But it was interesting that the sort of this social construction of science. Science is just another way of knowing, and I know that's very topical over there where you guys are.
It is indeed.
In it. And as I said once in a seminar, everyone's a relativist until they end up in the emergency department. And
Yes.
then all of a sudden, facts, empiricism, and whatnot matter, and the gender identity of the surgeon saving your life is really not so relevant.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things in which sort of relativism seems reasonable. Like, I think everybody's a relativist about ice cream flavors, right? It just would be silly if someone said, I like this kind of ice cream, to say, well, that's objectively the wrong kind of ice cream. But it doesn't work so well with sort of buses and things like that. If a truck is coming towards you, it doesn't really matter how you feel about it. You've got to get out of the way, otherwise it will objectively hit you. So actually, maybe we should just keep talking about this. I was going to ask you about some other things initially, but this is a really good segue into an article that we actually discussed in the very first episode of Free Kiwis. Obviously a historic moment for many people, including us. But it obviously took us several years to get you on the show. But yeah, this article is a Darwinian approach to postmodern critical theory. So maybe you could just sort of sketch out what you were trying to do in that piece.
Thanks. Well, it was a half tongue-in-cheek, because I was suggesting that we could start looking at the way that certain types of ideas had entered the academy and firmly ensconced themselves, certainly in the Hass disciplines, maybe more than the science disciplines initially. And what I thought I'd do is a sort of tongue-in-cheek reversal of what we've just talked about, which is that strong sociology of science, where all of science is explained through social construct. I was trying a sort of tongue-in-cheek reversal of that, which is all of the crazy stuff that people believe in, that extreme social constructivism, I suppose, as a precursor to what we see now, explaining it through an evolutionary lens. But of course, it ended up being quite a fruitful exercise. So while it was done slightly, with a humorous intent, it ended up becoming, I think, a reasonably serious argument that the assumption that ideas are truly tested on their merit within an institutional context, or, if you like, a sociological context, is clearly highly dubious. And that is, there is so much bias, there's so much signalling involved in your beliefs, your cluster of beliefs, how you position yourself. There's so many career incentives as well. So basically, I was applying a multitude of different lenses, dare I use that term, anything from memetics to evolutionary psychology, citing, obviously serious scholars along the way in their work, and basically trying to apply it in a reasonably systematic way to try to explain how such patently bad ideas have flourished within the academy especially. And of course, the danger there is that the academy, probably incorrectly and naively from many people outside the academy is seen as that place where knowledge is tested and that we can trust. Jonathan Rausch and others have talked about this. And I was trying to make the point that there's very good reasons to believe a whole lot of ideas in at least certain parts of the academy are actually pretty much BS. And we can now find a reason for it, rather than just a very sort of crude characterization that it's all, it's all Marxists or it's all this and that.
Well, one of my theories about this is that it flourished because of the expansion of the university. So when I was an undergraduate, at most I would say 10% of the population went to university and got degrees. Now, I think it's fairly similar in Australia and New Zealand at around 30 to 35%. So it's a massive increase. And of course, that means both an increase in the number of staff to teach those students and also an inevitable fall in the standards, the academic standards, because if you massively increase the cohort, we can assume that previously it was more or less the best 10% of school graduates who went to university, and now it's 3 times that proportion, and so a lot of them are not going to be at the same standard that 10% were. Now, if you take an approach like the postmodern one, and I've no doubt there have been some really good scholars in that area, but it's also very easy to fake, right? We've seen things like the Boghossian, Lindsay and Pluckrose hoax, and before that Sokal back in the 90s with his hoax, and it seems relatively easy to get away with publishing patent nonsense in some of these journals. And so it's a good way to get more people with PhDs and to give people the semblance of some kind of academic rigour that isn't really deserved, while sounding speciously erudite.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think there's two elements to that. One of which is the massification of education. In other words, pulling many more people in. And let's face it, the bell curve is about the same as it was in those years. So there is that. So catering to a massively increased cohort of students, and of course staff that goes along with it. And my analogy is critical theory in the academy is like the cheeseburger to critical thinking that it used to be. Students think they're getting critical thinking skills in the academy now, whereas often they're not. What they're learning to do is sheepishly apply critical theory. So it's like the cheeseburger mass production. After 1 year as an undergraduate, students can write a critique on some cultural this or political that, applying the theories of, and with very little real deep critical reflection. So I think that's the massification is one side of it. But the other side of it, which I think is tied to it but a little different, is everything that comes from that in the whole economy around the production, so-called, of knowledge. So the flourishing of journals, be it fat studies or anything else, the flourishing of journals and the economy around writing pieces for that, having editors for it, and so on and so forth. And I was actually reading some Popper recently, who I return to often, and he noted that we should always be careful of theories or ideas that can be applied so easily. I think it was in The Open Society and Its Enemies, the second volume, where he's talking about sort of the Marx and post-Marx period. And I think that's one of the challenges of much of this sort of critical theory, postmodern stuff, is that you can apply it like ketchup on anything, like tomato sauce. You can put it towards anything. But the fact that it applies so easily is not actually a test of its merit. It's actually quite the opposite, because unless you're comparing it to some other competitive theory as an explanation, it doesn't mean anything at all. Yeah. And Popper very astutely picked that up, many, many years ago.
Well, that's akin to the idea of falsification, I think. It sounds that way to me, that, a good theory wants to make as specific predictions as possible so that it's easiest to falsify, so that the evidence that you collect is going to say as much about that theory's veracity or otherwise as it can. If a theory can accommodate a vast array of different phenomena, then it comes close to unfalsifiability.
Mm-hmm. And therefore it really has no genuine explanatory power.
Yes.
But so we've got, I think the two things have combined, and there's no doubt that they are joint, a massification of education and the sort of predominance of, for want of a better word, critical theory, etc., which means that you can satisfy the apparent needs of critical thinking and the expansion of the academy into the real world, because this provides the sort of cheap, easy tool to do it. And of course, we're paying the consequences for it now in multiple ways.
That's very interesting, the point you make about critical theory, because you hear that word critical a lot, right? In the Contemporary Academy, we're doing critical studies. And some part of my brain has just worked out at this point that it often means something like, radically left wing, right? A critical theory or a critical approach is almost always critical of capitalism and liberal democracy and liberal humanism. It's almost never critical of Foucault, for example, or postmodernism or Marxism.
I always wondered why nobody ever took, say, a libertarian lens. It was always a Marxist one or a feminist one.
Mm-hmm. And that now is obviously reflected in the academy, the actual demographics of the academy. So how and why we got there, of course, is a fascinating question, possibly outside the reach of our conversation today, but we're certainly in it now.
But it's kind of interesting from the point of view of this evolutionary idea about ideas, evolutionary notion of ideas, because it seems like it's almost like a camouflage, right? That you have these departments where people are saying, look, we're doing critical theory. That's critical. And, the university is about critical rationality and, critical thinking. So we're doing that. It almost reminds me of a cult documentary I saw recently about, I think it was the Nixgram cult up in New York State. And the cult leader told everybody that what the cult was about was literally, I think, critical rationalism was the term he used. And of course, there was no such thing. It was all about following what the leader said. But it struck me as a similar thing where it sort of lulled people into this false sense of security. I'm not saying the university is quite as bad at this point as the Nix Graham cult was, but it seemed to me like a similar thing going on.
They co-opt words and use them to mean different things. And I mean, I'm a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist by training, but about 15 years ago, I joined a faculty of education. It took me about 4 or 5 years to work out that what they meant by theory was not the same thing as what was meant by theory in science at all, and neither was the word critical. So when you hear critical theory, the naive understanding or the scientific understanding is one thing, but what they actually mean by it is something else entirely, which, as James said, is
critical theory. That's right.
Yeah.
That's good.
Let's talk more about this Darwinian notion of ideas then. So is what you're saying that the ideas survive for kind of survival reasons, as it were? So, I mean, one possible hypothesis is, for example, like Christianity. So it comes into the ancient world, and a lot of the ancient philosophers look at it and think, this doesn't make much sense. But it survives and it flourishes. And one hypothesis is that it flourishes because it basically does something to the populations that are Christian. I mean, they're more strictly monogamous, they're more egalitarian, and maybe that helps them flourish and spread in a way that, paradoxically, other communities which may have ideas that we would see as sort of more reality-based, they don't flourish and spread in the same way. And actually, we talked to Eric Kaufman, Michael talked to Eric Kaufman last year, and I think one of his first books was about how, the demography of religions, and how Christians and people who are religious are just producing more babies. And so you can imagine that in the future, religions are going to keep spreading in a similar way. So is that the kind of mechanism that you had in mind?
Very much so. It's decoupling the assumption that because an idea flourishes, it must provide a particular insight into the truth or the world around us or whatever by any sort of rational standard. Now, it's okay if you accept that it's not a rational standard, but if you assume, as still many people would, or they're a professor or they're a chair of this department or they're published on this or, they appear on a particular documentary as the expert on something. The idea that ideas can catch on and flourish from an evolutionary perspective, taking a mimetic perspective of it, is that these ideas can flourish for reasons other than, and perhaps even counter to, whether they're really testing reality and a good check of reality. They're flourishing because, as we've already just discussed, the nature of the massification of education and a whole range of other things lead to these theories flourish in that environment, even if their track record in actual reality is abysmal often.
Yes.
That's quite apart from the replication crisis in the harder sciences, if you like, in the sort of psychology and elsewhere, the more scientific of the social sciences, if you like. So it's basically trying to decouple or disabuse people of the idea that the fact that there are departments, programs, journals, entire industries around certain types of critical theory or streams of it, that itself is not a sign of the merits of those ideas. It's a sign at the most obvious level, from an evolutionary perspective, of those ideas have flourished in this particular environment.
I mean, one big driver of, potentially wrong ideas catching on and taking hold and being really surviving despite being wrong is, I would say, group affiliation. If you have an idea that is widespread throughout a group, then it's totemic of that group. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not. I mean, in some circumstances it might matter if it's true or not. But as we reflected before, people will drop false ideas quickly when their lives are at stake. They won't care about the gender identity of their heart surgeon.
And I think that has a lot. I mean, Peter Boghossian's talked about this, the idea that what you believe signals you're a good person. And it's sort of spinning on that idea that your cluster of signaled beliefs, and I refer to the idea of costly signalling and signalling in general from the evolutionary perspective, that if you signal through your, the badges that you wear or the things you put on social media, that you align with these 3 or 4 key, often clustered beliefs, even though logically speaking, they have nothing to do with each other. You are signaling you are a person of the right kind, you are progressive, you are open-minded, you are X, Y, and Z. So, in fact, there's a really good paper, but I can't remember the name of it, about beliefs as possessions. A really good spin on that idea, which I came across subsequent to the article that we're referring to, but it very much captures that idea that...
You mean luxury beliefs?
Not true beliefs. Just beliefs signal who you are, and you carry them around with you as part of the package of your identity. Your sort of social, political, economic identity is informed by or is reflected in the beliefs you obviously publicly espouse.
James used the term luxury beliefs just then, which is perhaps signalling your status with your belief, that you can afford to believe this nonsensical thing because you've got so much status it doesn't matter.
So it's like Thorstein Veblen, the theory of the leisure class, this idea of conspicuous consumption. And it also goes into evolutionary theory, right? Because I think often in sexual selection you get these males with like these extremely long tails or whatever. And part of the point, it seems, is to signal to obviously they're not thinking this, but part of the point is to signal to the females, look, I'm so strong, I can fly well, even though I have this absurd tail, right? And so if you look at some of these ideas in that way, it's almost as if, you're saying to people, look, I'm so well off, I'm so high status, that I could spend my whole life, writing absurd papers about obscure topics, and they don't even make any sense, and I'm still making loads of money, and I'm still in better...
I'd say, the luxury beliefs idea fits well within that, but it's probably a bit broader.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea of, ideas having a Darwinian selection mechanism on them, I think is fascinating, and perhaps it leads us to appreciate more deeply the importance of disciplinary training, which is one of the balls that the university is in the process of dropping, because I would say most disciplines, certainly my discipline, science, trains us to think in ways that are actually quite counterintuitive. That it's an antidote to the biases that are ubiquitous in human psychology, things like confirmation bias, my-side bias, etc., by teaching us to be reflexively skeptical of claims and to ask for the evidence. And I can certainly remember just really what seemed like pedantic objections to experiments and theories when I was attending conferences and the like. And now I really appreciate that rigour, even though sometimes it was annoying because it was so pedantic. Yep. The fact that people had been trained to think that rigorously is a real antidote to these problematic ways of handling ideas, which might be just because they're appealing or because I want to affiliate to the group and so on.
Yeah, and look, I've got, I think, two observations on that. One of which is, obviously, that's a critical part of the feedback loop of testing ideas, be it from critical colleagues, critical friends, having rigorous methods, etc. That's really important, that sort of testing. So that's on the one side. On the other side, we're in an environment now where asking questions and posing challenges to some of the orthodoxies is itself demonized. So not only we don't have those, perhaps at times, pedantic checks and balances that would have been frustrating, I'm sure, on many occasions, and often they would have been petty, quite possibly. Now we're away from that. In other words, if someone comes out with a politically in tune and on-brand finding or interpretation of some particular wicked social problem, that's going to receive hardly any criticism whatsoever, whereas no matter how methodologically flawed it is, how small the data set is, whether it's through a particular lens, of course, which it almost certainly will be, when you see anti-racism lens, you pretty much know what that lens is. It's more like an Overton window. You're actually now actively discouraged from asking questions about the whole fundamental methodology and basis that frames that questioning. So it's not just we've lost that disciplinary expertise, if you like, and pedanticness, which has its value, but we've gone in a terrible opposite direction where how dare you question, the potential bias of so-and-so researchers because they've identified themselves with their pronouns or they've acknowledged that they have white privilege or whatever.
You're questioning virtue by doing so.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really toxic environment within the academy now, in certain disciplines more than others, but I'm sure it will continue to bleed into others.
And not only that, your license to ask questions is affected by your sex and ethnicity and the like.
This is one of the things I like about your evolutionary model, because it seems to imply that we can actually form the natural environment that does the natural selection, or we can engage in artificial selection, to put it in other terms. In other words, we can create the environment that sort of sets up the conditions for the evolution that goes on. So the kind of thing that Michael was talking about, it's basically like an extremely dangerous environment for creatures, or for ideas in this case. So you have to be an incredibly fit, you have to be an incredibly strong, sort of well-adapted creature, a creature well-adapted to things like criticism and testing, in order to survive in that economy, in that ecology. You know, whereas now we seem to be forming this alternative environment where what actually gets you to reproduce, what actually allows you to get ahead and to reproduce and to spread through the system, is coming from the right type of person, seeming nice, going along with the default assumptions that are fashionable at the moment.
Yeah, and of course the absolute tragedy is that, you know, I'm a very strong believer in the public good role of universities. I won't use the term social justice for obvious reasons. And, you know, there are so many problems globally, environmentally, socially, across any domain, that we need our universities and thinkers, the people who are paid to fearlessly engage with these challenging issues, we need them to be doing the best work for the best outcome in the real world. And there's, I think, a disastrous decoupling of the environment that we've just been talking about, sort of this artificial evolution, this artificial environment, with the actual remit that the universities are morally obliged to be engaged in. And that is actually trying to fix real-world problems with real-world solutions,
Right.
when we're not getting them.
Well, that might bring us to an ultimate limitation on how far this can go, right? Because although in the short term ideas might flourish for bad reasons, like group identity, like signalling and so on, in the long run, it's only sound ideas that will lead to benefits, like improved technology, and also potentially a perpetuation of the social license of universities, because they have to be funded and they have to attract students and so on. And I don't know what it's like in Australia, but New Zealand universities are struggling to attract enrolments at the moment. They haven't returned to pre-COVID levels, and that's not even counting the loss of international students. And I think there is a growing scepticism of the value of degrees, and a growing scepticism of what is actually going on inside these institutions. So maybe ultimately reality does bite, and good ideas do flourish on some timescale.
Yeah, and I mentioned that, I referenced that in the article, that ultimately it will fall apart. But ultimately might be how many decades, and how much harm, and how many untold millions or billions of dollars globally spent funding ridiculous ideas for ridiculous outcomes that haven't improved the world. In fact, if anything, that possibly made things worse. So it's more a matter of, you know, we can sit and let it happen, but the damage that's been done in the meantime is deeply concerning to me.
Okay, well, let's talk about your career, actually, because it's interesting. So you were dean for a time of arts and sciences, as I said at the beginning, at the University of Technology, Sydney. So when you're dean, I mean, you obviously occupy a key node in this network, and you really can sort of take part in designing the environment where ideas, you know, good ideas flourish or bad ideas flourish. I mean, that's at least my presumption. So what was your experience like as dean in the current environment? And is this something to do with why you're no longer dean?
May well be. You might have to ask other people that if they were prepared to talk about it. But I think deans have, certainly in the context here, there's a lot of stuff to do. I mean, you know, a faculty you still need a business sense. It could still be like the faculty is in charge of about $100 million turnover a year. There's still employees, governance structures, accountabilities, regulatory environments to work in. So there's all the stuff of actually sort of like running a bit of a business that you need to be competent at and good at, and I hope I was. Dealing with staff, having good relationships, building up trust. So all that has to happen as well. I'm sceptical if deans can shape culture that much. Certainly they can make it worse. I've known some deans who have been, you know, not good people, and not liked by staff. But I'd say ultimately, and if I talk in general terms only, ultimately my impact was limited. So whilst many people would come out of the woodwork and privately message me or even have a quick conversation in the lift, really like what you're doing, like the podcast with Josh Szeps, like that article you wrote, like that opinion piece, that never surfaced to the public. So whilst there was a significant minority, maybe even a majority of staff and students who would reach out to me and say, really like what you're doing, the culture of fear and backlash, and this is, I think, a general observation, is such that very few people would even be prepared to literally like a comment or an essay that I posted on LinkedIn that might have been critical about some of these things. So the incentives and the economy, and I think say the very highest leadership at universities, that all has to be in sync. So we're talking from the council level down. If it's all in sync, I think someone like me could have made an actual difference. But if it's not all in sync, it won't. And in a culture where, you know, social justice is vaunted as a key strategic pillar of a university, social justice and the search for truth and a proper feedback loop are totally incompatible. And if you're known to be not online and you're not on message with those things, I think one's career as a leader within academia is going to be short-lived.
And that's what you feel in your own case?
Quite possibly. Although always had very civil professional relationships with my colleagues, including my seniors at the university. I'm talking in general terms about the environment of universities now is that it's so much of a brand, and you know, student safetyism,
Yes.
John Haidt would probably call it. All that stuff is so much at the forefront. But in addition to that, and that's from the leadership and the branding and the positioning and the marketing, but also from the staff up, particularly in arts, social sciences and humanities, a lot of staff are obviously on the let's say on the far left. And they're quite happy being the predominance within their intellectual culture. So it's not like someone who wants to socially engineer the world through the programs they teach at universities to turn people into good little Marxists or postmodernists. It's not like they want to be teaching alongside someone that's gender critical or from the right. They're quite happy to have dominance within their academic community.
A political monoculture.
When someone comes along, and one of the things that amuses me is when I'm characterised as being from the right, nothing can be further from the truth. I'm a rationalist, humanist, positivist. And politics has nothing to do with that, despite what other people might say. So I've always been of exactly the same intellectual position throughout both my academic and my leadership career, is that show me the evidence. I'm open to where bias might exist, but I need to see where it is. And I want to see a diversity of perspectives that can be put against each other and challenged. And that's very, very basic stuff. And we fail to see that in the majority of our universities, and we fail to see the courage from our university leaders to ensure that happens. So while they, particularly the high-rated universities, put a lot of status in their acclaimed degrees or their ranking or their research outputs, often from the sciences, of course, a little bit different, there's fundamentally an utter cowardice on behalf of senior leadership within universities across the board to re-engage with fundamental questions about what the purpose of a university is. And I don't think, as a general rule, they like reasonably senior people within their institutions querying those fundamental purposes and motivations of what the institution should be doing.
They don't really like anyone questioning it.
Definitely don't like junior people questioning it.
No, that's right. Well, and I'd go further and say that the cowardice is across the board. There are exceptions to that, and we know some really brave people who have put quite a lot on the line and suffered as a result. I'm thinking of some of our colleagues. You've probably heard of the Listener 7, the ones who wrote against the idea that the science school curriculum should be infused with Mataranga Māori, the traditional Māori.
I know Kendall well.
You know Kendall, yes, and we have Elizabeth Rata and others. But the general rule is cowardice, either active complicity with the dominant view or just silence and keeping your head down. And that, to me, it would be understandable in many walks of life. Why should, for example, waiters or hotel cleaners speak up against an authoritarian regime? But academics, that's our job. That is literally our job, to point out falsity where we see it and to raise objections to bad ideas. And so it's a complete dereliction of duty not to do that. And it's understandable, of course, from the perspective of people needing a livelihood and so on, that they want to protect that. But then choose something else to do where it's not your job to be intellectually courageous, would be my point. So I think people leave the academy under these circumstances for two reasons. Either they are brave and speak up and get cancelled, or they get sick of it and leave of their own accord.
Yeah, and I think that's the case not only for the academy, but let's say in journalism as well. I mean, some of the sort of podcast phenomenon that we've seen over recent years, so much of that is people that are on the periphery of the academy or of journalism. They've been in mainstream, like New York Times, Barry Weiss, people like that, or Peter Boghossian himself. They've sort of been in it, but they've realised that they've been thwarted from doing their actual job because of all the things we've been talking about. So they end up sort of on the periphery. So while there's a lot of crazy stuff out there as well, I'd say, recommend to any university student or academic who's interested in these things, go and check out some of those good quality, including, Free Kiwis and other podcasts, because there's really good stuff there, which alerts you to the failures, the central failures within our institutions that we think are doing this work, but they're not.
Yeah, when you were talking a minute ago about how, the Marxists and the postmodernists, they don't sort of welcome conservatives and classical liberals. And part of me thinks, when I reflect on that it's in some ways kind of completely unsurprising. Because, if you actually are a card-carrying Marxist or a card-carrying postmodernist, you believe in Marxism, you believe in postmodernism, and you think that the conservatives are the enemy. And it actually requires a little bit more of an enlightened frame of mind to step back and realize, no, I'm working for the university has to survive and flourish. Well, if you're very enlightened, you believe in these principles just for their own good, that there should be, viewpoint diversity. But, it's also reasonably enlightened just to realize the strategic situation that you're in, that if the public comes to see that their tax money is all going to one side, or it's going to work which only supports one side of the political spectrum, the public aren't going to support that anymore.
I think it comes back to what I was saying before about training in epistemic disciplines. If you haven't been trained in a rigorous epistemic discipline, as these people haven't, then you haven't actually got the cognitive apparatus to see that you need to be challenged, that it's good to have people with different points of view. If you're a Marxist or a radical leftist, that it's good to have, right-wing people around you to challenge your ideas and improve them. It takes quite a lot of training to appreciate that.
I think it's that sort of tendency just to say, if you're a Marxist, just to want to hang out with other Marxists is so strong in human nature that I think that this is one of the other reasons why I think it can't really be, the problem with universities can't be solved from the inside anymore. They can't really be reformed from the inside.
Right.
Someone has to come in, and the viewpoint diversity at some point has to be almost forcible, because they won't tolerate, because they're so powerful and dominant now, they basically won't tolerate anybody to the left of Rawls, say, or anyone to the right of Rawls, unless they're forced to. And then, it does become a little bit more uncomfortable in some ways with viewpoint diversity, because you have to actually argue for once. But overall, it's much healthier in terms of actual intellectual achievement. And also, as I say, taxpayers might actually look at the university and say, if they're on the right, for example, here's something that isn't just obviously kind of partisan and sort of leaning to one side of the political spectrum.
And the other benefit, as John Haidt has pointed out, is general psychological resilience. If you are, it's a bit like learning to box or something like that, I suppose. No one likes being punched in the face, but if you get in a boxing ring and get used to it, then you're happier to undertake that. And I think it's the same intellectually. It can be uncomfortable to disagree and challenge one another's ideas, but if we get used to it, then we can learn to value it and even enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm pessimistic it's going to turn around.
So,
one of which is, and I wouldn't just clearly just have it as a sort of left to right. I'd rather have a sort of, there are still people on the left who I know well who would very much advocate for what we're talking about here, because they're like more classically liberal, or they're very strongly empiricists, and they understand the importance of evidence and things like that. But I think two things concern me. One of which, those that are driving a lot of these agendas, they have really seen the means of production within intellectual production, knowledge production, and they actually are committed to doing that, and they see that as the thing they should be doing. So they're not committed to universities being a place of exposure to viewpoint diversity. They're seeing universities as the means to create people in the shape of what they believe society should be. So they are genuinely dedicated to making sure there are no counter voices.
Yeah.
So they genuinely believe that. So there's that. The other thing, of course, is this toxic relationship between identity and truth claims. And that's where I think, yes, John Haidt's obviously right, where, people need to get used to having ideas challenged, perhaps ideas that they're very fond of, without being offended or triggered. But that is less and less likely to happen when our institutions are signalling that your identity is the most important thing about you, and you're coming to this sociological question or even a scientific question from the perspective of your X, Y, Z identity characteristics, which apparently gives you a particular insight into the problem that others don't have.
Yep.
Now, you can see the problem there is that if what you're saying about a particular problem might be race relations, might be in relation to gender, might be in relation to immigration, might be in relation to whatever, and you are doing so from the lens of these particular identity characteristics that are enabling you to have those insights. Of course, if someone starts questioning those insights, you've already tied your identity, your sense of being, your sense of identity, your purpose perhaps within others, or your status, you've tied it all to those claims. And so we've gone right down the rabbit hole of identity-led perspectives and truth claims, which means that the idea that your claims or ideas or theories, if you want to call them that, can be challenged in a sort of open-minded, fair-minded, civil way, of course, is a complete anathema to them, because you're challenging something that fundamentally comes from their position as an XYZ person. So universities are actually instilling that rather than challenging that at the moment.
Yep.
And we've been talking about what's led up to that, in the previous few minutes, but it means that I'm deeply skeptical that there can be an easy return to, hey, can we put some ideas on the table and discuss them and debate them civilly, when you've got someone that's going to preface their view of something by a whole lot of identity characteristics.
Yeah, I share your scepticism. We talked to Peter Boghossian on Free Kiwis a few weeks ago, and he has a very radical solution, which is to defund universities completely and allow new institutions to grow. And I'm not convinced that he's wrong about that. I mean, that might turn out to be the way to go. I think there are a few other things to try first, but I share your scepticism that they can come back from where they are without a great deal of help.
Yeah, and remember, there's people whose entire careers and reputation, many are tenured and, many are not. I've worked as a casual for many years, so I understand what having insecure employment's like, but many of the people pushing these things and driving the narratives and the viewpoints within our institutions, they've set up their own little fiefdoms. They've got their own departments, they might be editing a particular journal that they do their own conferences, they get funding for their PhD students to do topics that are appropriate for their perspective. They're not going to suddenly turn around and say, oh, okay, no, let's open up the opportunities here for a whole lot of other perspectives to engage with, challenging social or global or economic issues from a variety of other perspectives, unless it's within a very narrow range of precisely what they've been peddling. So, yes, I'm very, very sceptical.
Yeah, there's a limited number of options if we still do want to reform universities. And to be honest, to me, it just sounds too epic. It's too big a thing to just completely defund, say, all New Zealand's universities. So, I mean, one thing that I think has been tried in the States in some places with some success, the States is a bit more money swirling about, is to kind of fund centers of, you can call them centers of excellence, whatever, but basically centers where you can kind of Trojan horse, as it were, people who aren't extreme progressives into the academy. So one thing I suggested, I think, in my report on academic freedom was you could have a center for quantitative studies in education, right? And because education in New Zealand education departments is often not quantitative, and it's often just postmodern, and so you could just have that label on the building, and say this is where we're going to do quantitative studies, and then you just have a lot of empirical work. That's not even a political point, that's just a methodological one. But you could have a center for the study of traditions, and that could be a kind of beacon for conservatives. Or you could have a center for the study of human freedoms or something, and all the classical liberals could come on board. And it would actually kind of respect the kind of pluralism that I think hopefully, even sort of sensible left liberals would still defend in the university.
Yeah.
The problem with that is just that I think that has been a success in some places. I think there's a Center for Human Values that Robbie George runs at Princeton that's sort of held firm and been a beacon for kind of other ways of thinking. But the problem is that, once you get the Trojan horse into the academy and all the Greek soldiers come out, the tendency is for the Trojans to completely mob them and massacre them because they're just so overwhelmed.
If they bring the horse in the first place. I mean, I remember a few years ago, I can't remember who it was, offered quite a lot of money to set up a program in Western civilization in Australia, and no university would touch that funding. They didn't want it.
Oh, that's the Ramsay Centre.
That's the one.
Yeah, they've got a few programs running, one of which is at ACU.
Right.
But some of the prominent universities knocked it back because of activism within staff and students putting forward, motions and movements to object to the, cis, white, heteronormative, dead white man history, etc. And so I think they're very proud of that. But yeah, so look, there's the odd attempt with varied success, and I wouldn't say that the Western Civilization program sounds like a very fine program. I don't know it well, and for those who want to do it, they can do it. The problem is it's all the other stuff. It's reaching the untold thousands of students that go through the sausage factory of an education program or a bachelor's degree or whatever. So while I think the Trojan horse tactic is a good one, it's good to have stuff there and signal universities can actually commit to some viewpoint diversity or supporting different values or perspectives. I fail to see that meeting students at the sort of undergraduate first lecture level where they're introduced to, we're going to challenge you here, we're going to confront you with ideas that might not be challenging, but not in the orthodox ways that you're told that these ideas are challenging about your identity or your whiteness or your sexual or gender identity or whatever. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I think at Auckland at the moment there's currently a battle about this compulsory first-year course in the sciences, which, because it's sort of overwhelmingly run by these people who are basically activists for Mataranga Maori, they've inserted a lot of that perspective into it again. And so the mainstream courses all seem to be, or not all perhaps, but like a lot of them seem to be captured by this one way of looking at things.
It's complete poison to science. I mean, they're basically indoctrinating them against science before they've even studied it. So
they think they're learning science, but of course.
Yes.
Of course, I know Kendall and others have spoken very eloquently, and Kendall was on Peter Boghossian's podcast not that long ago, speaking very eloquently and with a lot of nuance around recognition of open-mindedness to and respect for different knowledge traditions, of course. But as soon as you start putting the word science in there, or as soon as you start making, and I've said this before in other interviews, people can have a whole lot of perspectives and belief clusters and backgrounds that lead them to a particular claim. But if you make a claim that's about the world around you that we all live in, we're all entitled to test that claim.
Well, that is
like, what flavour of ice cream do you like? Don't care why. Or you can have a variety of reasons, don't care why. Although I'm sure even liking a certain type of ice cream is racist nowadays. But the problem is that if you make claims about the world that go beyond your particular tradition, so you're making claims about geology, geography, the actual history of a land, a country, the world, the universe, Big Bang Theory, the stars, the galaxy. If you've got knowledge systems that actually make concrete claims about that rather than being metaphors, law, as we have in the West, that's what our religions have done and various other things. But if you make claims that touch on the idea of a scientific claim about the reality of the world, and that world by definition we are all sharing and walking on. The oxygen is the same for you as it is for me. Blood is the same for you as it is for me when we're in the ER. If you make those claims, but then you are not open to having them tested in a scientific sense, then they are not science.
That's clearly true.
You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, but yet they want to have it both ways. So they want to have the epistemic status of science without the rigour or without being subjected to the rigour. And you mentioned the idea, and a bit of respecting people's cultural ideas, and that's okay up to a point, but if testing them is seen as disrespect, then we have a problem. Yeah. I recall, in fact it was in the same week that listener letter criticising the idea of Mataranga Māori in science was published. I was privy to some draft assessments for the school qualifications in New Zealand in biochemistry. And I kid you not about this, the claim was made that if you are fermenting food products, be it beer or making bread or whatever, and you say correct karakia, that is to say prayers, in the presence of the fermenting product, that the fermentation will be enhanced. This was a claim made in a biochemistry assessment standard. Now,
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Now, my response to that was, we could test that claim quite easily. You could easily set up an experiment to either say the correct karakia or to recite Shakespeare as a control condition, and we'd see which culture grew the best, if either.
Well,
but
you might discover placebo for beer. Who knows?
But of course, had I suggested that out loud, that would have been held down as racist.
Yeah. So that's very much what we were talking about before with that identity and truth claims, but at a group level, which is absolutely cancerous to intellectual inquiry. And a lot of people would agree with what we've said. I think a lot of people, even in the universities, would agree with what we said. But do you think you get them to put up their hands in a forum?
Yeah.
Or to speak publicly about it? No, I don't think so.
I mean, this is why I actually would go even further than Kendall. I mean, I think Kendall's been very brave and he's very nuanced in his interview with Peter Boghossian. But I actually have a problem even with the idea of knowledge systems, different knowledge systems. And that's why I prefer to use the term Maori traditional lore for Maturanga Maori. Because knowledge for me is justified true belief. And there are some things in Maturanga Maori, like knowledge of local plants, which may well be empirical. But it just seems to be question-begging to state from the outset that this system is knowledge. And I also object to the very idea that there are different systems of knowledge and ways of knowing. I actually think that ultimately humans have there is a single way of knowing about empirical truths. And then, of course, it's true that not everything is empirical, not everything is logical. So, it's not an empirical matter who you fall in love with or what kind of music that you like listening to or where you go with your life, right? So these are other questions. But when it comes to sort of empirical knowledge and inference and things like that, all human beings actually have the same routes to knowledge.
We have the same cognitive apparatus for knowing.
Look, I'd agree. That's a good articulation of a strong position on it. I suppose what I'd say to be generous to the counter is that in other domains other than empirical, and of course I know a lot of this does speak to empirical, so social norms, social niceties, traditions within cultures, etc. Obviously, knowledge systems using perhaps a lowercase k rather than an uppercase k, they're obviously important in how sort of societies have run. But if there's a disconnect between that and empirical questions, then it's unlikely your society is going to make much positive progress. So I still think it's not a great thing, no matter how you cut it.
Yeah, but so the question there would be, so why are these knowledge systems? What you've been describing there seems to me that they're systems of etiquette, which is fine. You can, and I agree. Like if you go to a foreign country, you should respect their traditions to a certain extent. But I don't know why those are systems of knowledge then.
Yeah, it's probably just it's a polite and nuanced way of not quite going out on.
To me, there are two things. One is knowing itself, which is a cognitive thing, and that's the same for all humans because we have the same structured brains irrespective of our cultures. But the other is the means of testing truth claims in the first place. And there are different approaches, even across disciplines. So the methods of history are not the same as the methods of science because history is constrained by the kind of evidence you can get. You can't generally set up an experiment in history, whereas in science we have the luxury of being able to do that.
Yeah, even so, I'm not sure they're different systems of knowledge.
I'm not saying they're different systems of knowledge. Yeah. I'm saying they're different epistemic approaches to testing truth claims.
I wouldn't even say that. I would say something like they're taking the same approach, but history has the misfortune of not having the right kind of evidence or the same kind of evidence.
Perhaps.
Or it's you can't do experiments in history. That's true, but I think you're still trying to do the same things. I mean, so for example, when you're writing an essay about Shakespeare at school, I mean, I was trained at least to look for evidence in the text. So the evidence is textual. So it's not the same as if you're trying to test a theory about human psychology, in which case the evidence won't be textual. You'll have to sample a population, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, there's the same idea, there's the same approach, which is to look for the relevant evidence and collect it and be aware of possible biases and, be aware of what you're missing and then try and make, statements and inferences and then, of course, try and falsify it. Try and see what might be wrong with it.
Yeah.
The empiricist within me agrees with you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, we should end soon because we're coming up to an hour. But I wanted finally just to change tack completely and ask you quickly about the Australian version of the Free Speech Union, because as we said at the beginning, the president of this organization, Toby Young, founded, I think, the first free speech union in Britain a few years ago now. I think Michael and I were both kind of early joiners of that. Then, I think this is right, the New Zealand Free Speech Coalition refounded as the New Zealand Free Speech Union, and we're also keen collaborators with the Free Speech Union in New Zealand, which is fantastic. So tell us about the Free Speech Union in Australia.
So Free Speech Union in Australia was set up, it's a sister organisation, affiliated, but of course they're not, if you like, formally, structurally affiliated. So there's a variety of free speech unions popping up. There's one in South Africa. There's obviously a New Zealand one, which looks like it's going terrifically well. The Australian one was launched late in 23, and it's a small operation at the moment because we're growing. I'm the inaugural president, such as it is. So I only came on into the role late last year in December. So I'm working very much on sort of strategic plans, building membership, building awareness, being in interviews, writing commentary, essays, etc., with my Free Speech Union hat on, as opposed to my academic dean hat on. So it obviously gives me a lot more freedom. So in many ways, the topic areas that pertain to free speech type issues or controversies, I think they're probably the same in New Zealand as Australia and probably elsewhere. But of course, the jurisdictions are different. The laws or lack of laws protecting free speech are different. We actually don't have anything like a Bill of Rights or constitutional sort of insurance around free speech here. So the free speech unions in these types of countries have a really important role that, because there's no fundamental, absolutely concrete protection for free speech, it's sort of in a constant state of flux and tension with a whole lot of often government policies. So misinformation and disinformation bills, hate speech or vilification laws, whether they're state-based or federally based. So we're sort of very attuned to those kinds of things as winding back whatever sort of free speech entitlements that we feel that we have. So that's one half of it. A pretty straightforward way, I suppose, of articulating it. The other half is really what I'm passionate about, and speaks to what a lot of our conversations being up to here, is the self-censorship that happens. So it's not actually, universities and academics supposedly are protected by, academic freedom requirements of the institutions. And yet, despite that, they're incredibly reluctant to talk on controversial issues unless it's of the one particular framing, precisely because of all those things that we've been talking about. But that leads to, damaging one's career, mobbing, crowds of angry students outside screaming at you, whatever it happens to be, putting in complaints about you for causing harm. That happened at my former university because I had Peter Boghossian on campus. So some students or staff put in a complaint to my superiors that I was causing harm to the university by having him there. So there's the sort of that's the cancerous underbelly of free speech issues that I think many people in the community wouldn't be aware of. And then there's the obvious stuff like legislation, laws, case studies and things like that. So I'm passionate about both of them, and we're still, as I said, in pretty early days, and I'm really keen to help steer the Free Speech Union in Australia into a more prominent position so we become well known. We've already been successfully working, my colleagues here, been successfully working on particular cases that relate to things like decisions by the e-Safety Commissioner with geo-blocking of tweets or content on X and things like that. So there's enormous amount of work to do, but we're starting from a sort of a pretty early base. And because of the, if you like, the constitutional status of free speech, which there really isn't one here, there's an enormous amount of work to do. And I think Australians generally have been a bit slow to wake up to encroachments upon free speech, because fundamentally they're not well protected here.
Well, generally people are slow to wake up, and I think that's because we've lived, our early lives in an environment where it was taken as a given. And so it certainly took a shock to wake me up. It was the banning of a former opposition leader from a university campus that made me kind of think, what on earth is going on here? And that galvanised me relatively early, perhaps. But it does take, people who don't concern themselves every day with these kinds of matters a long time to notice that the temperature has changed.
I think I just assumed that the idea was so well embedded in sort of Anglophone culture. Like, I was born in Canada, I grew up mainly in Britain, but in both countries I just thought, of course, everybody believes in free speech. I mean, it's partly because, first 8 years of my life were during the Cold War, and so I don't remember it very well, but I remember that the atmosphere was very much like, the bad guys are the communists and we're the free world, and we very much had a sense of ourselves as we're the free world. Kids used to say to their parents used to say go to bed, and used to be like, it's a free country, and people, it's kind of trivial, but that was the mood where we lived in free countries.
My daughter still gets me on free speech grounds.
Well, good, I'm glad to hear that. But
you've exactly nailed it there, because it's the idea that I think many people are so used to free speech being sort of a norm, a sort of casually accepted norm, that it's actually quite tenuous. And we're seeing in a variety of ways, particularly through the academy and with sort of activist-based work trying to suppress free speech or twist into ideas of hate speech causing harm and vilification, etc. We just need to be constant of where those boundaries are and where they might be encroaching. And I think there's just that sort of casual assumption that it's there, but it will know when it's gone, and I think we're beginning to see various encroachments on it now.
And I think you're right to put your finger on self-censorship and the less kind of formal assaults on free speech. If hate speech legislation or online disinformation bills and so on are proposed, then you have a clear target to deal with. And I think in New Zealand, the Free Speech Union has been remarkably successful in dealing with those threats. And I've seen the Australian Free Speech Union already enjoying success in defeating the online safety bill or whatever it was called. But it's that wider culture of valuing free speech and encouraging people to speak up, and I think educating young people to be able to contest ideas civilly but forthrightly. These things are easily lost from a culture, and then it doesn't matter what your legislation is, actually, you're stuffed.
Yeah, although I also think that we would benefit in other Commonwealth countries from some kind of First Amendment like they have in the United States. I used to think, it's great we have the sovereignty of Parliament, we're not the states, they have a very strong constitution, which also has its limitations and its downsides. But now I just think you can't really run a liberal democratic constitution without some, very serious provision for free speech, because you can't have liberalism without free speech, because people can't speak their minds and they can't express themselves and they can't sort of advocate for the lives that they want to live and talk about them. You also can't have democracy, though, because democracy is about people power, right? And people can't advocate for their views and they can't sort of take part in the political process fully if they're not allowed to sort of say what they want to do, we've seen examples of that recently with issues like immigration in Europe, where it's just become very difficult for people who want less immigration to talk about it, because everyone immediately calls them a racist, right? So I think it's just so fundamental to both liberalism and democracy that we have to have it as part of even a very minimalist constitution. We just have to have it at the center of everything that we do.
Yeah, and really embedded and nourished through our education system. So starting even at school, I think, would be the place, because by the time you get to university, a lot of harm can be done at school.
And not only that, the young people at that point are much older than is desirable to start to inculcate those values. I mean, you can argue that people's basic values are in place by the time they're about 8 years old. And so I think I agree, we need to do much more work early in primary school, and I would like to see it built into our school curriculum in certain ways, that because we're educating people to be citizens of a democracy. And as James has said, if you don't know, if you don't live in an environment where you can contest ideas, or you don't know how, your democracy is in trouble.
Yeah, agreed. And particularly with the sort of sacredness around certain perspectives around multiculturalism, immigration, how different cultures should be valued or not valued. Assimilation's now a dirty word, but there are a lot of people coming to democratic liberal countries excuse me, that don't necessarily have very strong democratic liberal views. And so one of the ironies is that if we can't, excuse me, if we can't openly challenge, query, question, and criticise clusters of values that tend to belong to certain communities, which might be deeply corrosive to a well-functioning civil and multicultural society, that'll just make everything worse. So I think a lot of the stuff that's happening with vilification and hate speech, particularly when it relates to those kinds of things, is actually going to make the situation worse. It will make multiculturalism in Australia, which is by and large, I think, very successful, it'll make it even less successful than it is at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's historically been very successful in Australia, dare I say it, because the immigrants were coming from countries where a certain degree of liberality was valued.
And it's hard to get here.
Well, there's that as well.
It's even harder to get to New Zealand.
But now the demographics coming to our countries have changed, and I'm not opposed to that at all. I think it's good in a way, but it needs to be regulated at a pace where people can be assimilated into the broad values that matter to keep a liberal society open. I don't care what religion people have or ultimately what their politics are, as long as they're willing to accept the meta ideas that keep liberal democracy alive.
Although strangely enough, I mean, all the stuff we've been talking about in this podcast, especially with the undermining of universities, I mean, that hasn't really been immigrants, right? It's been sort of like wealthy,
that's true.
White people.
It's a very good point.
I'm not saying there's no challenge from that problem that you guys are talking about, but yeah, it's sort of striking that this illiberalism is kind of, we did it to ourselves.
Yes.
That's what really hurts, as Radiohead say. You know. All right, Alan, thank you so much. And I would like to ask a final question, which is, what is the name of your cat?
The one that's here is Phryne.
Well, thank you.
We thought he was a she.
Oh.
And maybe they identify as that.
Oh.
And then he started growing testicles as a little kitten, and we realised that actually she
is a he.
Was a he. So he.
You bigot, Alan. You don't think that females can have male testicles?
Well.
Yes. Sorry.
So that's our cat, and he's been very patient. He's been wanting to get out of the room, and I haven't got up to let him out.
Well, thank you very much for his contribution to the conversation. Sorry.
Absolute pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
And thank you very much for your work with the Free Speech Union and everything else you've done.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.